Welcome back to the Business Exchange, the show where we dive into ideas, people, and innovations shaping industry and redefining the future. I'm your host, Joseph. Today I'm joined with Jeff Passmore, a longtime leader in Canada's renewable energy and industrial bioeconomy space and the founder of Scaling Up Conferences, which brings together innovators, investors, and policymakers focused on building a globally competitive bioeconomy. Jeff has spent decades working at the intersection of sustainability, capital, and industrial transformation. And today we're talking about what it really takes to scale the future economy. Well, Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, Joseph.
Yes, you're quite welcome. Perfect. So, you spent over 4 decades in renewable energy and in industrial innovation. What moments or experience led you to focus so deeply on the bioeconomy?
When I first got started, I was working primarily, as you say, in renewable energy, so that would have been solar and wind and small hydro, and to the extent I was doing anything in biomass, it was bioenergy for power generation, heat and electricity. But over a number of years, I was in the consulting business, and I had a client that was trying to turn fiber into second generation ethanol. So most of the ethanol we get now, as you probably know, comes from grain, primarily corn, or from sugar cane and the sugar in sugar cane. But it can also come from the fiber. So in the case of, for example, wheat, you wouldn't use the wheat grain, you'd use the straw. Or it can come from any biomass, any wood or trees or crops or grasses. So having done that for 12 years, I decided then to go back into private practice and focus entirely on the bioeconomy, which has a breadth of technology applications. Think of it this way. Well, first of all, I'm not sure how many of your listeners know what we're talking about when we talk about bioeconomy. So just think of biology. I mean, everybody probably took a biology course in high school. Mm-hmm. And so what we're talking here is basically using Mother Nature, biology, trees and crops and grasses, basically carbohydrates and all the sugar that are found in carbohydrates, and using those to replace hydrocarbons. So you can use trees, biomass, to replace a barrel of oil. And we can do that with about 90% of the stuff that you and I currently consume. So the obvious examples in the bioeconomy that everybody knows about is probably the first thing people would think about are renewable fuels, ethanol and gasoline, maybe sustainable aviation fuels, because the airlines are trying to figure out how they can reduce their carbon footprint. Renewable fuels would be one. Bioenergy, I mentioned before, which is probably the lowest thing you want to do with biomass, which is just to burn it to create heat and electricity. But for example, if you're a First Nation, why are you flying in diesel fuel when you're surrounded by forests and you could be putting in a biomass boiler for the same amount of heat and electricity? But the exciting stuff really are biochemicals for a whole host of bioproducts and materials. So everything from paints to plastics to cosmetics to textiles and industrial cleaners and solvents, and everything that you can imagine that currently comes from a barrel of oil, from hydrocarbons, could instead come from trees and crops and grasses. And actually, this is happening all over the world, but to a lesser extent in Canada, which I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but it's kind of counterintuitive given the amount of biomass Canada has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, that's very interesting. So what problem did you see that inspired you to launch the Scaling Up Conference?
Well, I was sitting at the dining room table with my wife in spring of 2016, and I mentioned to her that year I was going to be speaking at 4 different bioeconomy conferences globally, one in San Francisco, one in Washington, D.C., one just outside Milan in Italy, and one in Amsterdam. And I said to her, maybe I should create one because we don't have a similar type of conference in Canada. And so after humming and hawing for 5 or 6 weeks, my wife said we better do it because otherwise you'll never know what could have been. And besides, I'm tired of listening to you talk about it. So we didn't have a mailing list, we didn't have a website, but we got all that pulled together, and we did the first conference in November of 2016. And so in November of last year, 2025, it was our 10th annual conference, and this year in 2026, of course, it'll be the 11th. But now, obviously, in the pandemic, we did it virtually in 2020 and 2021. We ran the conference virtually just to maintain the brand, but we've been back live ever since 2022. And we have it in Ottawa, in Canada, because that's where the federal government is. And even though there are about 30 countries in the world that have national bioeconomy strategies, including all of Canada's trading partners, from China to India to Brazil to all of the European Union countries, and of course the US has a very fascinating program called BioPreferred. I can talk about that in a minute. But despite the fact that all those countries have national bioeconomy strategies, Canada does not. And as I mentioned, that seems kind of counterintuitive because on the forestry side, we have 9% of the world's forests, something like 348 million hectares, if it doesn't all go up in flames first. And we've got 60 million hectares of ag land that we can be using, as well as a whole lot of municipal waste, organics that can no longer be landfilled. And then there's opportunities for marine biomass as well on the two coasts. So a lot of biomass in Canada. And we need to be adding value to that biomass rather than just making 2x4s or whatever and worrying about exporting lumber. Yes, we need to do that. We need to build homes, and actually mass timber is a fantastic use of Canada's biomass, where you can actually build tall buildings. University of British Columbia has a 18-story residence that's mass timber, which, as it turns out, is faster, cheaper, and more sustainable to build than using concrete and steel. That used to be the tallest mass timber building in the world. It's not now. There are others taller than the 18 stories, but that's just one example. But like I said before, everything from paints to lipstick could be made from biomass. And I mentioned the U.S. BioPreferred program. That is a program run by the United States Department of Agriculture. And believe it or not, it's been in place since 2002. So here we are 23 years later, 24 years later, and Canada has nothing comparable. And if you just Google one word, BioPreferred, and the website for that program will pop up, and in the catalog there are over 16,000 items that are independently certified. You can't self-certify, obviously, but independently certified as minimum 25% biomass based. So anything from 25% up to 100% biomass based. And that's a whole bunch of products and materials that are in that catalog.
Wow.
And the other aspect of the BioPreferred program that's amazing is it requires mandatory federal government purchasing if there's a biomass product available to replace a non-biomass product, then the biomass product needs to be procured. So, I mean, that creates an incredible market pull for bio-based products because, of course, the U.S. government includes the military. So there's a huge market pull created there.
Yeah, very nice. So earlier on, did it feel more like a business opportunity, a policy mission, or a system-level challenge?
It felt like a policy mission, and it still does. We've been doing it now for 10 years, and we still don't have a national bioeconomy strategy. So one could conclude that it's been a colossal failure. Although, as some people have pointed out to me, well, Jeff, that's not your fault. I mean, the good news is, first of all, the conference is a huge success. It's extremely popular. People love the content. We have good content every year, new content, speakers from across the bioeconomy, not just Canadian speakers, U.S., European speakers. And we tend to get, even though it's in Ottawa, it is a business conference. So, 80% of our registrations would be from business. But the other 20%, anywhere between 50 and 60 bureaucrats come. And that's who the audience is. And so, and they come from all the obvious departments: Natural Resources Canada, Environment Canada, Transport Canada, Agriculture Canada, Department of Finance. Last year, for the first time, we had somebody from Department of National Defense, which was great because there's a connection, obviously, between um, defense and the bioeconomy, and the extent, that the bioeconomy makes us more self-reliant. And um, it's but it is a policy initiative. It's a labor of love. Um, I mean, luckily, it's modestly profitable, but that's primarily because of all the sponsors that we get. You know,
Right.
we spend several months lining up sponsors for all of the food and beverage, and paying for all that. We do not ask the federal or any provincial governments for funding for the conference.
Right. Good. So what sectors within the bioeconomy do you believe are the most underappreciated or misunderstood?
Well, first of all, if I talk about the bioeconomy, nobody knows what I'm talking about. You know, typically when you say bioeconomy, if you're at a cocktail party or whatever, and people say, "What do you do?" It's not you have to have your elevator pitch, I guess. And so
Yeah.
I just say, imagine that everything that you currently consume that comes from a barrel of oil could come instead from trees. That's the bioeconomy. I mean, it's not just trees, as I mentioned. It's crops, it's grasses, and so on. It's algae, all kinds of different things. But that's the quickest way to describe it. Yes, the bioeconomy writ large, and just defining what that is.
Yeah.
And by the way, the International Energy Agency and the OECD and all these various places have definitions of the bioeconomy, but primarily it talks about replacing, using in this case, Canada's natural biological resources to replace hydrocarbons, to replace oil, or if not replace it entirely, obviously, supplement it.
Yes.
Because you're not going to be able to do everything with electricity. And that includes all the specialty chemicals that I was talking about earlier. Anything that paints and plastics and cosmetics and industrial solvents and so on aren't going to be made with electricity or come from electricity. So,
Right.
But the exciting part, so I don't know. I mean, it used to be that the first thing that happened in the bioeconomy was ethanol was added to gasoline. Ontario mandated it in 2007. The federal government mandated it in terms of low-level blends. It's blended at 10% in all gasoline now, and the feds did that in 2010, 5% on average, but everybody blended 10% because ethanol has a high octane value. I mean, if you're thinking about what octane you're buying, if you're buying 89 or 91 octane at the gasoline station, well, the octane value of ethanol is 113. So
Right.
it's a very inexpensive source of octane, rather than using a lot of the hydrocarbon sources of octane, which
Right.
are carcinogenic. Race car drivers are switching to ethanol, because it's not carcinogenic the way the hydrocarbon
Right.
Racing fuel is. So people probably, when they pull into the gas station, don't even realize that there's ethanol in it, because of course it used to be that companies would advertise this product contains 10% ethanol, but now it's just part of gasoline, the way dozens of other carcinogenics are part of gasoline.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then bioenergy, well, of course, yeah, you can burn wood for heat. I mean, people do it in their wood stoves, their fireplaces, whatever. But the exciting stuff, as I mentioned, are biochemicals. For all those 16,000 products and materials that I mentioned are in the U.S. Department of Agriculture Biopreferred Program. And that's the part I think that's really underappreciated. If you think of a barrel of oil, barrel of oil produces high volume, low margin fuels. So, the margins you make on selling gasoline or diesel are very, very small. So, but the volumes are high. And that's about 80 to 85% of the barrel. And then the other 15% of the barrel is specialty chemicals for making everything from lipstick to paint. And so that's low volume but high margins, because
Right.
people will pay $10 for a tube of lipstick that costs 75 cents to make. So
Yeah.
the margins are high, but the volumes are low. And the same thing is true with respect to a tree. You can take the sugar that's in a tree and turn it into ethanol and into specialty chemicals. And those things combined will make you a profitable biorefinery as opposed to an oil refinery.
Right.
Now, some companies have found that it's very expensive, building a biorefinery. So in fact, they're trying to focus exclusively on the specialty chemicals side. And as I mentioned, that's the exciting stuff, is the fact that we can get all these products and materials from biomass. And one of the things I don't think people realize is that one of the unintended consequences of going paperless is more forest fires. And how do I make that connection? Well, because less demand for wood and forest products equals less forest management. And less forest management means more forest fires.
Yeah.
We need to get really into managing our forests much more productively, efficiently, and we need to create way more demand. I mean, there used to be 13 pulp and paper mills in Ontario. Now I believe there are only 3. There used to be 5 in Nova Scotia. Now there's 1. The sawmills that are supposed to be providing all this lumber to build all these homes that Canada wants to have built, where are they supposed to send their sawdust? They used to send it to the pulp mills, to make paper, for example. I still subscribe to a daily newspaper, but very few people do. You used to get on a plane and everybody would be reading their newspaper. Now, I'm probably the only person on the whole flight reading a paper.
Yeah.
But so we need to recreate that demand. If it's not through reading newspapers and buying books and that sort of thing, then it's through creating demand through the bioeconomy.
Right. Good. So from your perspective, what are the biggest financial bottlenecks holding back bioeconomy scale up?
Well, it is expensive, and of course, so 2 things. There's the cost involved, and then there's the incumbents. So, you've got a lot of incumbents. We currently get all these products and materials from fossil fuels. And of course, they don't want to lose that market share. So that becomes an impediment. And investors are looking and saying, well, is this a good place to be putting our money? I mean, depending on which type of, where you at in your technology evolution, if you're looking at, trying to raise venture capital money, well, those guys, first of all, they're not putting in hundreds of millions. They might put in 5, 7, 10 million into a company that has a good story to tell. But a lot of them are putting it into AI these days. That's where that's where the exciting stuff is, according to some people. So raising capital is a challenge. You probably need to find a strategic investor, somebody with deep pockets. So I used to work for a company here in Ottawa called Iogen Corporation, and our big investor was Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, the oil company, and they were looking for ways to diversify because of mandates in Europe, and we ended up commercializing our technology actually in Brazil using sugarcane bagasse. So when you crush sugarcane and take out the sugar, the fiber that's left is called bagasse, and all that fiber is full of cellulose, which can be turned into sugar. And once you've got sugar, of course, you can make anything. You can make alcohol, you can make ethanol, you can make bio-based materials. So definitely raising capital is a challenge. These biorefineries can cost you over $100 million, sometimes $200 or $300 million, and many of them have tried and failed. But increasingly, governments are looking for how do we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Although in the current world, climate change and greenhouse gas emission reduction seems to have taken a back seat to a lot of the other problems we're facing, having to do with war and tariffs and so on. But climate change isn't going to go away, and I think the bioeconomy offers an elegant solution that simultaneously for Canada would create jobs in rural communities, on the farm and in the forest, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time increase the GDP. I estimate that if we got serious about the bioeconomy in Canada, it would add about $200 billion a year to Canada's GDP. So that's huge. That's almost, what is that, 7-8% of Canada's GDP.
Mm-hmm. No, it is huge, and we know that there's a lot of other places our country needs to get going and to build our economy. But that's a subject, I guess, for another day. All right. So, what financial signals tell you that bioeconomy project is truly investable?
Well, that's a whole long answer. I mean, there's the technology risk, there's the scale-up risk, there's the management team risk, there's the feedstock risk, and do you have a guaranteed feedstock supply? Do you have an offtake contract with somebody that's actually going to take your product? And all of these things have to line up in order to make a project financeable. And by the way, just because a project looks to be economic, you often hear people say, well, when will your technology be economic? But economic, okay, fine, it doesn't mean it's financeable. The places that have money to invest have got all kinds of competing options as to where to invest that money.
Yes.
Typically, for example, if you're looking for a big strategic investor that's going to put in, tens of millions of dollars, they have other places that they could put that tens of millions of dollars where they have a guaranteed rate of return because they're going to invest it in the industry that they already know well. And so, for example, when Shell was talking about investing in iGen and cellulosic ethanol technology, the thing that made them nervous was the fact that they understood drilling wells, for oil, but to contract with, 100 farmers, individual contracts for straw supply. I mean, this was something that was outside their comfort zone. And so it became, that's partly why we ended up building in Brazil, because the bagasse was already there at a sugarcane plant. So the sugarcane was making sugar, and the bagasse was there to co-locate a second generation ethanol plant. But so I mentioned before incumbents and the fact that they would rather just invest in their core business. The other thing is, you have to be able to show a path to multiple plants. So, for example, many of these big strategic investors, they require an internal rate of return 20%, maybe 18 to 20 to 20%. I mean, that's the hurdle you have to cross. Well, there's no way your first of a kind commercial plant, and by the way, you cannot skip steps. If you're scaling up, you start with fundamental research in a test tube, and then you do applied research on the bench, and then in beakers, and then you go to a pilot plant, maybe 1,000-liter tanks. Then you go to a demo plant in 100,000-liter tanks. Then you build your first commercial plant, and then step 6 is wide-scale commercial rollout, where it's something that you and I can buy at Costco or Canadian Tire. Well, that first commercial plant, and by the way, iGen's demo plant, so we, step 1, fundamental research, applied research, pilot, demo. That demo plant we thought was going to cost us 20 million, cost us 80 million. So everything costs way more and takes way longer. We thought we could get it done in 2 to 4 years. It took us 10 years. So things cost more and take longer than you expect, which is why you need to find a partner with deep pockets and a patient partner, which venture capital is not. They want a 10x return, and they want in and out in less than 5 years. So, but so you simply cannot skip steps, you need a path that's going to show your investor that after they take a haircut on that first plant, because there's no way it's providing them a 20% internal rate of return. So the first plant, you'll be lucky if it's low single digits, 2, 4, or 5%. Then the second plant might be 10%, and the third plant might be 12, and so on. So you have to show a path to 50 plants. And then they'll say, okay, it will take a haircut on plants 1 through 6 because we know we're going to make our rate of return on plants 7 through 35. And of course, that requires government policy certainty. And that's one of the things that scares big investors, is the fear of stranded assets. Governments are coming along all the time and changing their mind about things. So, are you going to make a several $100 million investment only to find out that the government's changed its mind on the policy? Now, sometimes those things can be grandfathered, but so certainty, and I'm talking now policy certainty, is the mother. Everybody knows this. Necessity is the mother of invention. Well, my phrase is certainty is the mother of investment. And in the absence of certainty, you're not going to get a lot of big companies making those investments because of fear of stranded assets.
Right, right. So where do you see the most resistance to change within Canada's economic system?
I think Canada is not bioliterate. I think that is the biggest issue, and that's partly why we have the Scaling Up Conference.
Right.
When you look at what's going on, I mean, the fact that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has had a biopreferred program for 23 years, and we've been talking to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for 15 years about why can't we have something similar with no progress. And now, part of the problem in the Canadian federal bureaucracy is that people are constantly changing jobs. And so you just get somebody up to speed and briefed, and the next thing you know, they've moved to a different department. But in any case, the whole issue of needing to be bioliterate, and that's partly why we do Scaling Up Conference in Ottawa. There are a number of, I shouldn't mislead you to the extent that in the absence of a bioeconomy strategy, there are companies in Canada doing things. I mean, I mentioned Iogen and its commercialization in Brazil. I haven't mentioned, but there are other companies. And there's a company up the Ottawa Valley called Ensign Engineering, and they've done work in the bioeconomy space in food additives and things like that. So the absence of a federal government policy strategy, initiative, directive doesn't mean that companies don't get on with doing things. But what a strategy does do, it sends a signal to the market that, oh, the Canadian government is serious about this space. Maybe we better have a look. Because when I travel internationally, and a lot of the companies that have gone through, let's say, the first 4 stages of what I described from fundamental research and pilot and demo, and they're saying, gee, where should we build, either they've built a pilot plant and they're wondering where should we build our first commercial plant, where should we build our demo plant, or where should we build our first commercial plant? Nobody's thinking about building in Canada. They're looking at Brazil, they're looking at Southeast Asia, they're looking at Eastern Europe, like Poland and so on, and they're looking in the U.S. And when I say, well, why haven't you thought about Canada? And we're not on their radar. Well, but we have huge amounts of biomass and huge amounts of federal and provincial government funding. When I say huge, I mean, if you're talking about a $100 million plant, you could probably get about $30 million from various federal and provincial programs, which means that now all of a sudden you don't have to raise $100 million in debt and equity, you only have to raise $70 million in debt and equity. And you have to raise that money before the government money comes in. I'm not talking about the government providing, walking around money to keep the lights on, but there's hardware, steel in the ground, infrastructure. And so I think, and I'm repeating myself here, but I think Canada needs to become more bioliterate. I think this is a generational opportunity for Canada. It's not the sort of thing that comes along, every time. If we do not add value to our biomass resources, by that, as I said, I mean trees and crops and grasses, and we add value and start making these bioproducts and material, then guess what's going to happen? We're going to end up importing it all. Whereas instead, we could end up exporting it. Europe is hungry for bio-based products and materials, and gradually they're putting in place something they're calling a carbon border adjustment tax. And if you want to export something to Europe that has got a high carbon content, then it's going to get taxed based on that carbon content. However, if you've got something the opposite with a low carbon content, or it's biogenic carbon, which is what biomass is, rather than fossil carbon, then the biogenic carbon is going to find an easier export market in Europe. And what are we doing right now? We're trying to find new export markets. We're trying to find new places to sell our stuff. So we should be selling all of that bio-based stuff to the world. Otherwise, we're going to end up importing it from the world.
Yeah. No, it's no different than traditional oil and LNG and everything. If we could actually get it to market, we could do very well for our country. So, where do you see AI having the most immediate impact on the bioeconomy?
Well, I'm a little bit out of my depth there. I would say I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, I talk to friends of mine who are working in the space, and they say, well, AI can get involved in doing design. For example, designing tall, mass timber, tall wood buildings. Design can be done with using AI. I mean, anywhere you use a computer, anywhere you're doing any kind of work like that, then AI can be involved and help, reduce costs and save time and labor. Although interestingly, people keep asking me, well, where are the jobs going to come from in the future if everything is going to be done by AI? And I say, well, a lot of the trades are still going to require people to be, hands-on. Putting in a fire suppression system in a building, for example, a fire is not probably going to be done. I suppose it could be done by robots at some point, but so
No, not typically. Yeah, no, you're right. The trades are somewhere where will survive AI. You're going to call a plumber; he needs to come and investigate it and see what your problem is and then fix it. So, yeah, there's a lot of safe industries like that. So, how might AI improve supply chain forecasting, feedstock optimization, or life cycle analysis?
well, let's just talk first about feedstock. I mean, when we were looking at where we would find enough cereal straw, you look at maps and you have, models, and you can, but there was no substitute for going. And I'm not sure if this is a role for AI or not, because there was no substitute for boots on the ground and going and talking actually face to face to farmers and growers. I mean, you can do everything you want using models and maps that have been, maps have been taken from whatever 20,000 feet, and it says, okay, look, there's all this wheat growing here in Saskatchewan, and all this wheat growing in Alberta. And therefore, you can count on a ton an acre of straw, and you need 200,000 tons of straw. So here's where you can get it, and you can build. We thought, when we first did it, we could build 5 plants in Saskatchewan, let's say. We also looked at Alberta and Manitoba. And when we got boots on the ground, we found out that there are all kinds of reasons why farmers didn't want to part with their straw. I mean, first of all, you would never get any from the clay soil zones, because they want that straw to stay, in the ground or be plowed back in, or they're practicing low-till agriculture or whatever. The soil quality doesn't want to see the straw removed, and the same with the brown soil zones, but maybe to a lesser extent. So it's the black soil zones where you could start thinking about removing straw. But even then, if we were I used to live in Saskatoon, and friends of mine are farming 10,000 acres. Well, they're not going to sell you 10,000 acres of straw, even if they had it all in wheat and canola. They might give you a contract to sell you straw from 3,000 acres, and then rotate every year which 3,000 acres they took that straw off of. So that, so you're looking at maybe being able to get 30% of the available feedstock in any given region. And so I don't know whether AI can replace that or not, because AI would also probably give you an assessment of, well, here's the data, and here's how much straw is available in a given region. But then they don't go and interview farmers, and then there were other reasons why farmers. It wasn't just, okay, we don't want you to take more than 30% of the straw. We don't want you coming in here with heavy equipment, big heavy balers and so on, that are going to compact the land. So, and then some farmers wanted to be part of the entire value chain. So they would windrow the straw, they would bale it, and they would put it roadside, or they would load it immediately on trucks, and they would deliver it to the ethanol plant. Other farmers said, no, we don't want to do any of that. You come and bale it and take it away. But you've only got a 2-week window to bale it, because we want to be back on the land, 2 weeks later. So, and then of course you get into, well, we had a late or early spring, or we have snow when we didn't expect snow, and we can't get on the field, and so there's all sorts of things, and you know, everything from "please come and take it all" to a guy with a shotgun saying "don't come near my land."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that takes time to scale up on that end. So, what excites you most about the intersection of AI, biology, and large-scale economic transformation?
You know, you should really encourage your listeners to read a report that came out from McKinsey Consulting. Everybody probably knows the McKinsey Consulting Group, and in May of 2020, they came out with a report called The Bioeconomy. I don't have the title exactly at the top of my head, but something about changing our lives. And in that, they talk a lot about what I've been speaking about, but why is this happening? How is it happening? It's happening because of the intersection of biology with artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on and so on and so on, about 5 or 6 things, and all of these things coming together in a technology revolution and complementing one another. And so it's not just biology working by itself, or AI working by itself, or machine learning, or whatever of these various things all working by themselves. It's the technology and the science and the AI and everything all working together. It's a little bit like the opposite of the poly crisis. People talk about the poly crisis because we're going to have all these different crises coming together at the same time: population, climate change, war, whatever, and so all these crises taking place at the same time are called a polycrisis. Well, I forget what the term is for all these technology solutions coming together at the same time, but that's what's going to drive the success of the bioeconomy, is the fact that it's not just advances in the science of biology. I mean, we understand biology way more now than we ever did in terms of, genomics and stuff like that. But then marrying that with all these other advances in science and technology is what's really, according to the McKinsey report. And they estimate, now that report came out in 2020, and at that point they estimated this would be a $2 trillion a year business globally by 2030. Well, and I thought 2 trillion, that's a pretty big number. And then I went 2 trillion a year, wow. And why couldn't Canada, get 10% of that, which is where I come up with my 200 billion figure, because we do have just about 10% of the world's forest. And so, but now that report that came out in 2020 and talked about 2 trillion, now everybody says, well, it's way too conservative. I mean, things have happened so much faster in the last 5 years than they did in the previous 30.
Yeah, that's usually how it works, and there's always a greater opportunity as things change in science and technology change. So, Jeff, this has been a powerful conversation. You've given us a clear look at not just the promise of the bioeconomy, but the real financial, policy, and execution challenges that come with scaling it. For anyone listening who wants to understand where the future economy is heading, be sure to explore Jeff's work and the Scaling Up Conference, where some of the most important conversations about industrial transformation are happening. Jeff, thanks again for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the plug for Scaling Up, which this year is November 18 to 20 in Ottawa.
Oh, excellent. Perfect. And thanks again for everybody joining into the Business Exchange. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and share it with some building investors who are shaping the future. And we'll all see you next time.